Story 1. Don't enter these woods. The sign had been there longer than anyone in Harlow Creek could remember. Hand-carved from what looked like pine, weathered to a gray so deep that it almost turned black. 3 words burned into the wood with something that wasn't quite a brand. The edges too uneven, too organic, like the letters had grown there rather than been carved. Don't enter these woods. No name, no county seal, no explanation. Marcus Hale had photographed it 17 times over the course of his life. Once as a boy of 8, sitting on his father's shoulders while his dad laughed and called it local flavor. Once at 14, when he and 2 friends dared each other to touch it and run. And 15 more times after that, as a hobby photographer, as a journalism student. As a man who had grown increasingly convinced that the sign was not a warning from people. The wood never rotted. In a forest where everything decayed, where fallen trees dissolved into mulch within seasons, where even the fence posts the county installed along the highway's shoulder rusted and crumbled within a decade, that sign stood, perfectly preserved. The letters as sharp in Marcus's most recent photograph, taken 3 weeks before everything happened, as they had been in the one his father had snapped in 1987. He had shown the photos to a dendrology professor at the state university. The professor had studied them in silence for a long time. "That's not pine," she finally said. "What is it?" She had handed the photos back without answering. Marcus wasn't supposed to go in alone. That had been the agreement with his editor. He was doing a piece on the Harlow Creek urban legend for the regional magazine, a soft human interest story about folklore and small-town superstition. He was supposed to bring a photographer. He was supposed to stay on the trail. He was supposed to be back before dark. The photographer canceled at noon. Marcus told himself the trail was clearly marked. He told himself it was October, but still warm enough. He told himself the story needed authenticity, boots on the ground, real description, not something cobbled together from Google Maps and old newspaper archives. He crossed the tree line at 2:17 p.m. He noted the time, because the moment he stepped past the sign, his phone went to 0 bars. Not low signal, 0. He had expected that. The Harlow Creek woods were a known dead zone. He had a paper map, a compass, a headlamp, and enough trail mix to last 12 hours if it came to that. What he had not expected was the silence. Not quiet, silence. The complete pressurized absence of sound that you only encounter in places that have decided they don't want to be heard. No wind, no bird song, no rustle of small animals in the undergrowth. The trees, massive white oaks mostly, some of them clearly centuries old, stood without moving. Not a single leaf trembled. Marcus stopped walking after about a quarter mile and just listened. Nothing. He pulled out his recorder and spoke into it. Trail is clear. Visibility good. Temperature has dropped. Significantly more than I'd expect this close to the road. No wildlife sounds. The folklore about the woods being dead quiet appears to be accurate. He pressed stop. In the recording, underneath his own voice, there was a sound he had not heard while standing there. Breathing. He didn't hear it in real time. He heard it that evening, sitting in his car in the parking lot of the motel, hands shaking slightly as he scrolled back through the audio. Deep, slow, rhythmic breathing. Not one set of lungs. Several, overlapping in a pattern that was almost, not quite, but almost synchronized. By then, he had already seen what was carved into the trees. Not all of them. Not even most of them. But starting at roughly the half-mile mark, every 4th or 5th tree had something cut into its bark at eye level. Not words, not symbols he recognized. Shapes that seemed almost geometric until you looked at them from slightly to the left, at which point they resolved into something that might have been faces. Long faces. Too long, with eye sockets that were too high, and mouths that were too wide, and something where the nose should have been that wasn't a nose. He photographed all of them. When he got back to the motel and uploaded the images to his laptop, every single photograph of the carvings was black. Not underexposed. Black. Solid. Total. Featureless black. As though the lens had been covered. The photographs before and after were fine. Only the ones containing the carvings. He called his editor. "Come back," she said, without hesitation when he described it. "The story isn't worth it. There's something in those woods," Marcus said. "I don't mean an animal. I mean something that has been there a very long time and doesn't want documentation. Marcus, come home." He did. He drove home that night, telling himself it was over, that he would write the piece from a distance, lean into the mystery, leave the truth deliberately vague the way good folklore pieces always did. He was halfway home when he noticed the passenger seat. There were leaves on it. White oak leaves. Still green, still fresh. 5 of them, arranged in a shape he recognized. The same shape as the carvings. He had locked the car before entering the woods. He had been alone the entire time. He had not stopped for gas or food. He pulled over on the highway shoulder, got out of the car, and stood in the cold night air for a long time. Behind him, about 2 miles back, the forest line was a dark strip against the darker sky. He couldn't be certain. The distance was too great, the light too poor. But he thought he could see something standing at the tree line that hadn't been there when he drove past it going the other direction. Tall, very still. Where the head should have been, something that was too wide. He got back in the car. He did not look in the rearview mirror for the next 40 miles. The story was never published. Marcus Hale resigned from the magazine the following week, citing personal reasons. He moved to a city on the coast, somewhere flat, somewhere with no forests for 100 miles in any direction. But his neighbor, a retired schoolteacher named Donna, told the building super the following spring that the man in 4B had started leaving his apartment lights on all night. Every night. That sometimes, very late, she could hear him through the wall, not talking on the phone, not watching television, just sitting very still. And breathing, as though he was listening for something breathing back. The sign still stands at the edge of Harlow Creek Forest. The wood has not rotted. The letters are as sharp as they have ever been. And if you go there on a clear day and stand close enough to read it, but not close enough to cross the tree line, you might notice something that every photograph fails to capture. The sign doesn't just face outward. There is a second set of words on the back, burned into the wood in that same uneven, organic script. 4 words, facing inward, facing the dark between the trees, facing whatever is in there. 4 words that make it clear the sign was never meant for us. They know you're watching. Story 2. Something Lives Here. The Geological Survey team arrived on a Monday. 4 of them, Priya, Caldwell, a grad student named Tess, and their equipment coordinator, a quiet man called Ruiz who had done 30 surveys over 15 years and claimed nothing surprised him anymore. They were mapping soil composition in the Delich State Forest, a routine job, 3 weeks in the field. Back home by the end of the month, Priya had done surveys in Alaska. Caldwell had worked a site in Montana where a grizzly had walked through camp twice in one night, and he hadn't lost a minute of sleep. Ruiz had once finished a survey during a tornado warning because the data window was closing and the funding didn't allow for delays. None of them made it 3 weeks. The first indication that something was wrong was the soil itself, not the composition, the temperature. At roughly the 2-mile mark into the forest, in a band that ran in a rough north-south line through the survey grid, the soil temperature dropped sharply. Not slightly. Not in a way attributable to shade differential or moisture retention. In a band about 40 feet wide, the ground temperature registered nearly 11 degrees colder than the surrounding forest floor. Priya flagged it on the first day. Caldwell suggested an underground water feature, a buried stream, possibly, or a limestone cave system with cold air venting upward through fissures. Reasonable, documented in other forest systems. She logged it and moved on. On the second day, the band had moved. Not dramatically, perhaps 15 feet to the west. But the instruments didn't lie, and Priya had placed marker flags the previous afternoon. The cold band was no longer where it had been. It was in a new location, and the marker flags were gone. Not knocked over, not buried. Gone. Tess suggested animals. Someone suggested wind, which even Tess acknowledged was ridiculous, given that the flags were 18-inch steel stakes hammered 4 inches into the ground. Ruiz said nothing. He looked at the new position of the cold band for a while. Then, he looked back at where it had been. It moved toward camp, he said. Nobody responded to that. The sounds started on night 3. Not animal sounds, or rather, not sounds that fit any animal in the regional fauna guide that Caldwell kept on his tablet. Low, resonant, almost subsonic. The kind of sound you feel in your sternum before you consciously register hearing it. It came from no specific direction. It seemed to come from the ground itself, or from the spaces between the trees where the dark was thickest. Tess recorded it on her phone. When she played it back the following morning, the sound was there, but there was something else layered beneath it. A pattern, almost like syllables. Not words in any language she recognized, but the shape of language. The rhythm of something that was trying to communicate. She played it for the others over breakfast. Ruiz put down his coffee and didn't pick it up again. "We're leaving," he said. "We have 2.5 weeks of survey left," Caldwell said. "We're leaving today." "Ruiz, come on. It's probably I did a survey," Ruiz said, quietly, in the Cascades in 2014. Different forest, different state, same sound. He looked at each of them in turn. There were 5 of us that trip. I am the only one who finished the survey. Silence. "What happened to the others?" Tess asked. Ruiz picked up his coffee after all. He drank it slowly. The official report says 3 of them got lost. 1 had a breakdown and was hospitalized. He set the cup down. What the official report doesn't say is that we found one of them. Miles from where he'd gone missing, sitting against a tree. Alive, eyes open. And? He didn't know his own name. He didn't know any names. He didn't know what a name was. He sat there and looked at us and made a sound. Ruiz paused. The same sound that's on Tess's recording. They broke camp in 40 minutes. They were packed and moving toward the access road when Priya stopped. She had looked back, not because she heard anything, not because she saw movement. She looked back the way you sometimes do in a forest. That instinctive backward glance. The evolutionary remnant of something your ancestors needed to survive. There was nothing there. Trees. Morning light filtering green through the canopy. The flattened rectangle of dead grass where their tents had stood. And in the center of that rectangle, where none of them had placed it, where it certainly had not been when they broke camp, a marker flag. One of the ones that had gone missing on the first day. Planted in the ground. And next to it, pressed into the soft soil in a line deliberate, evenly spaced. 5 indentations. 5. 1 for each member of the team, including Ruiz. Something had been counting them. The survey was completed 6 months later by a different team, a larger one, with a different route that avoided the cold band's original location. They reported no anomalies. But the lead surveyor on that second team filed a private note, not in the official report, just a personal email to a colleague describing something she had found on her last day in the field. A section of ground, deep in the forest, where the soil was so cold it had frozen solid in the middle of autumn. A circle, roughly 30 feet across, and in the center of the circle, sunk 2 inches into the frozen earth as though something very heavy had stood there for a very long time. 2 depressions, side by side, the shape of feet. But the length of each one was 4.5 feet. Whatever left them, she wrote, was not something that should exist, and from the depth of the impressions, she estimated it had been standing there for a while, waiting. Story 3. Never go into the forest. Her grandmother had said it every summer, without exception. From the time Della was 4 years old and spending July at the old house on the edge of the Varnick Woods, through every summer after that until she was 17 and too old, she thought, to spend summers anywhere but the city. Every single year, on the first morning of every visit, her grandmother would sit across the kitchen table with both hands wrapped around her tea mug and say the same thing. Never go into the forest, Della. Not be careful in the forest. Not stay on the path. Never go in. Full stop. As though the forest were not a place but a condition. As though entering it were less like trespassing and more like agreeing to something you couldn't take back. Della had always assumed it was the standard rural grandmother concern. Bears, maybe, or the creek that ran fast after rain, or simply the fog of old age settling over a memory of some long-ago childhood accident in the trees. She had nodded, obediently, every year. She had never actually obeyed. The Varnick Woods started 40 feet from the back door of her grandmother's house, separated by a stretch of overgrown yard that was more wildflower than lawn. As a child, Della had gone in constantly, picking up interesting stones, following deer trails, building small cairns along the creek bank. Nothing had ever happened. The woods were ordinary, beautiful even, in the way that old-growth forest always is. Light moving through the canopy in columns, the soft floor of decades of leaf fall, the smell of living decay that was somehow more comforting than unpleasant. She had never seen anything unusual. She had never felt watched. She had never experienced so much as a sprained ankle. Which was why, when her grandmother died in March and left the house to Della's mother, and Della drove up alone in June to begin sorting through 40 years of accumulated belongings, she thought nothing of walking into the forest on her first evening there. She just wanted air. The house smelled of old paper and lavender and something else. Something low and sweet and faintly wrong that she couldn't identify, and she needed to clear her head. She went in at 7 p.m., when it was still light. She found the photographs inside a box in the attic on her third day. The sorting was going slowly. Her grandmother had been meticulous about most things, but chaotic about storage. There were shoeboxes of letters alphabetized by sender, but also 3 separate boxes simply labeled things in her grandmother's spidery handwriting, and an entire trunk of photographs with no dates, no labels, no organization of any kind. Della had been sifting through them looking for family history when she found the ones of the forest. Black and white. Old. The paper had that particular soft quality that photographs develop over decades, and the images had the high contrast, slightly overexposed look of old film. They were all taken from the same position, the back doorstep of the house, looking toward the tree line. There were dozens of them. In most, the tree line was simply the tree line. Trees, undergrowth, the gap where the yard ended and the forest began. Ordinary, But in some of them, not all, not even most, but enough, there was something else. A shape. In the trees. The same shape in every photograph that contained it. Tall, narrow, positioned at the exact same spot between two white birches near the left edge of the tree line. It was only ever partially visible. It seemed to be facing the house. Della spread the photographs across the attic floor and sorted them by whether the shape was present or absent. The ones containing the shape were dated. Her grandmother had finally begun dating photographs in the 80s, small penciled numbers on the back. Della arranged them chronologically. There was no pattern to when the shape appeared. It wasn't seasonal. It wasn't consistent year to year. Some years it appeared in multiple photographs. Some years, not at all. But every photograph that showed the shape had something else in common. Every single one was taken on a day when, according to the weather journal her grandmother had kept faithfully for 40 years, Della had gone into the forest. She didn't sleep that night. She sat in the kitchen with every light on and read her grandmother's journals cover to cover, all 11 volumes, going back to 1973. Her grandmother had never written about the shape directly. That was the most frightening thing. She wrote around it, the way you write around something you don't want to make more real, by naming references to watching the back fence carefully tonight. To the same feeling as last Tuesday. To Della went in again, and I didn't sleep until she came out. And once, just once, in the volume from 1991, when Della would have been 9, a single line that was different from all the others in its directness. It follows her. Not to hurt her, I think. But it follows her. It has since she was small. I don't know what it wants. I only know it stays in the trees as long as she stays out of them. The rule is simple. The rule must hold. Never go into the forest. Della finished sorting the house in 11 days without going outside after dark. On her last afternoon, she stood at the back door and looked at the tree line for a long time. Then she got in her car and drove home. She sold the house that autumn. She never went back. But sometimes, in her apartment in the city, she wakes at 3 in the morning with the absolute, unshakable certainty that she is being watched. She gets up. She checks the windows. She is on the 14th floor. There is nothing outside. She goes back to bed. She lies in the dark. And sometimes, not always, but sometimes, she can smell it, very faint. Almost not there. The forest. Leaves and soil and living decay. Right there in the room with her. It followed her out. Story 4. The Woods ARE watching Owen Fraser had been a wildlife cameraman for 19 years. He had spent weeks alone in the Alaskan interior waiting for footage of wolves. He had camouflaged himself in reed beds for 4 days straight for 30 seconds of nesting footage. He had dangled from a harness over a cliff face in the Faroe Islands photographing seabirds while a storm moved in from the North Atlantic. He was not, by any reasonable measure, a man given to imagination or nerves. Which is why, when he told his producer that something in the Heller Mountain forest had been watching his cameras, she believed him. The assignment was straightforward. 3 weeks documenting forest wildlife in the Heller Mountain Preserve for a nature series. Owen had done similar work in 6 countries. He set up his standard grid of motion-triggered cameras, 12 units, spread across 2 miles of trail and undergrowth, and settled into the rhythm of the work. Check cameras each morning, download footage, reset triggers, repeat. The first week was normal. Deer, a black bear passing through on the second night. Fox, raccoons once, excitingly, what appeared to be a fisher cat that local naturalists had suggested was no longer present in the preserve. The second week, the cameras started going dark. Not malfunctioning, going dark. Motion triggered, battery-powered, with a 6-month battery life and no history of failure. 7 of his 12 cameras stopped transmitting. When he retrieved them physically, they were intact. Lenses unbroken, housings undamaged, batteries still holding charge, but the footage from the hours before each one went dark was missing. Not corrupted, deleted. The files were gone from the memory cards as though they had never been recorded. Owen was methodical. He checked for user error. He checked for equipment failure. He contacted the manufacturer. He reinstalled firmware. He replaced 4 memory cards. The cameras went dark again within 48 hours. It was the 5th camera, the one he retrieved on day 16, that changed everything. This one hadn't gone dark. This one had continued recording normally, motion triggering through the night, and Owen almost skipped ahead through the footage when he loaded it. 14 hours of an empty trail, almost certainly nothing but the occasional passing deer. He didn't skip ahead. Professional habit. He watched it at double speed, sitting in his camp chair with his laptop, and at 3:17 the footage caught something that made him take it back to normal speed. A figure. At the edge of the camera's range, in the last few feet where the night vision began to degrade into gray static. Standing completely still, facing the camera. Not an animal. Facing the camera. Directly, precisely, which required knowing where the camera was. The unit was mounted at knee height on the north face of a tree trunk, painted to match the bark, and Owen had been placing cameras professionally for nearly 2 decades. You did not see them unless you knew they were there. Owen sat with the laptop for a long time looking at that frozen frame. Then, he watched the rest of the footage. The figure stood there for 43 minutes without moving. At 4 low, exactly it turned. Not like a person turns. Not with the micro adjustments of weight and balance that human movement involves. But instantly, like a frame cut in a film, and walked into the trees. It did not trigger the motion sensors on any adjacent camera. Owen packed up the next morning, not in a panic, methodically, the way he did everything. Packed the cameras, packed the camp, drove to the access road. He filed his report to the producer that afternoon. Equipment failure, he called it. Irrecoverable data loss. He recommended the network find a different location for the segment. His producer asked him once if he was okay. Professionally fine, he said. Personally, he paused. Something in that forest knows what a camera is, Angela. It knows what I was doing there. It didn't want documentation. And it was smart enough and patient enough to figure out how to prevent it. Owen. The one it missed? Camera 5? I think it missed it because I'd moved it the night before. Changed the position by about 6 feet. Whatever was doing the rounds knew where everything was. But it hadn't updated for that one yet. Silence on the line. It was doing rounds, he said quietly, like it was managing the situation. Like it had a plan. He never went back into fieldwork in forested locations. He moved to marine documentary work, open ocean, no trees, nowhere for something to stand and watch from cover. But he kept a copy of the footage from camera 5. He keeps it on an encrypted hard drive and has shown it to exactly 4 people. All 4 of them had the same reaction. They watched the figure stand motionless in the gray-green night vision for 43 minutes. They watched it turn with that instant, inhuman precision. They watched it walk into the trees, and then, before Owen could stop them, all 4 of them scrolled forward through the remaining footage. The empty trail, the dawn coming up through the trees, the normal morning world. All 4 of them stopped at the same timestamp. 6:47 am. Full daylight. Owen himself, visible at the upper edge of the frame, walking the trail with a camera case over his shoulder, and at the edge of the frame, just barely in shot, half hidden behind a tree so large it would take 4 people to circle it with their arms. The figure, still there, watching him pack up and leave. Story 5. You Won't Come Back. The trail was called the Meridian Loop. 7 miles, rated moderate, popular with day hikers. 4 people had disappeared on it in the last 6 years. Not died, disappeared. No bodies recovered. No gear found. No distress signals triggered. Just people who went in and never came out, leaving cars in the trailhead parking lot, and phones that went to voicemail, and families who spent years looking at the search and rescue reports trying to find the variable that explained it. Jenna Marsh was writing a book about it. She wasn't a hiker. She was a journalist. Long form, mostly crime. One published book about a cold case in Ohio that had done well enough to get her a second contract. Her editor had pitched the Meridian Loop disappearances as true crime adjacent. 4 missing people. No explanations. A trail that kept taking people and giving nothing back. She had spent 3 months on research before she ever set foot on the trail itself. She knew the names and faces of all 4 missing hikers. She had spoken to their families. She had read the search and rescue reports, the ranger station logs, the geological surveys, the wildlife management records. She had found one consistent data point across all 4 disappearances, buried so deep in the bureaucratic record that she was fairly certain nobody else had noticed it. All 4 hikers had disappeared at the same mile marker. Mile 4.3. She went in with a satellite communicator, a personal locator beacon, a guide who knew the trail, and her own recorder. The guide's name was Pell, a lean, sun-weathered man in his 50s who had hiked the Meridian Loop hundreds of times without incident and treated the disappearances with the pragmatic sadness of someone who had done body recovery work and knew that the woods were simply unforgiving of mistakes. He did not know about the mile 4.3 data point. Jenna had chosen not to share it. The first 4 miles were unremarkable. The trail was well maintained and clearly marked, running through second-growth forest that was pleasant without being dramatic. Pell set a steady pace and talked when Jenna asked questions and fell into easy silence when she didn't. At mile 4, Jenna checked the GPS on her satellite communicator. At mile 4.1, she noticed that Pell had slowed. "You okay?" she asked. "Fine," he said. "I always slow down here." "Here specifically?" He glanced at her. "There's a section just up ahead that I don't like. Never have. I've done this trail since I was in my 20s, and I always feel it right around here." He paused, like something changed in the air. Jenna's recorder was already running. At mile 4.3, she understood what he meant. The best way she could describe it later was subtraction, like something had been quietly removed from the world. The birdsong that had been a constant backdrop for the previous 4 miles was simply absent. The quality of the light changed, not darker, just different. Like the light in a room where something has shifted that you haven't identified yet. The temperature dropped measurably. Her communicator showed 3 fewer satellites in the signal list. The trail at 4.3 passed through a small clearing, perhaps 50 feet across, where the tree canopy opened. In the center of the clearing, there was nothing. No marker, no feature, nothing to distinguish it. Just grass and the open sky. But around the perimeter of the clearing, the trees were wrong. Not visibly, structurally wrong. They were trees. They stood the way trees stand. But every single one of them at the clearing's edge was facing the same direction. Not their trunks. The trunks were fixed. Their branches. Every branch on every tree circling that clearing extended toward the center. Not the way trees grow toward light. These were growing toward something at ground level, something in the middle of that empty grass circle. Pell stopped walking. "I don't go into the clearing," he said. "You've never mentioned a clearing in any of our conversations," Jenna said. "No," he was very still. "I don't like to think about it when I'm not here." Jenna looked at the clearing for a long time. She looked at the trees with their branches all pointing inward. She looked at the grass in the center, which was longer than the grass at the edges, and which moved very slightly, very steadily, without any corresponding movement in the surrounding air. She looked at her GPS. "Mile 4.3. Have you ever gone in?" she asked. Pell was quiet for a moment. "Once," he said. "Years ago, before the disappearances. I walked to the center and I stood there and I looked up." He stopped. "What did you see?" "Nothing," he said. "That's the problem. I looked up and I saw nothing. No sky, no branches, nothing, just black. In the middle of the afternoon in August, I looked straight up and there was nothing above me." He started walking again, away from the clearing along the trail. "I came out of there and I walked the remaining 3 miles, and I drove home, and I didn't come back to this trail for 2 years. And the disappearances? All 4 of them were solo hikers," Pell said. "No one with them. No one to walk them past it." He kept his eyes on the trail ahead. "The clearing pulls at you, Miss Marsh. You want to walk in. You feel like there's something there worth seeing. Like if you just go a little further, take one more step." He shook his head. "The ones who went in didn't have anyone to walk them past." Jenna looked back over her shoulder once. The clearing was already out of sight around the bend. But she could still feel it. That pull. That sense of something worth seeing, just out of reach. Just one more step. She turned back to the trail. She kept walking. She didn't look back again. Her book, published the following year, described the clearing in detail. It named the mile marker. It laid out the pattern. The chapter was titled, "You Won't Come Back." The week after the book launched, the ranger station received a record number of calls asking for directions to mile 4.3 on the Meridian Loop. They closed the trail 4 months later. A 5th hiker had gone missing. Story 6. They aren't animals. The sound started on the 2nd night. Nina had camped alone before, many times, across many states. She was competent, experienced, and had exactly 0 patience for the genre of campfire story that ended with, "And it was a bear all along." She knew what bears sounded like. She knew what deer sounded like crashing through underbrush at night. She knew the sound fox made that was disturbingly close to a human scream, and she knew the deep owl hoots that could fool a nervous camper into thinking something large was breathing outside the tent. She knew animal sounds. What she heard on the 2nd night was not an animal. The Breck Forest campsite was technically dispersed. No facilities, no neighbors, just a flat clearing half a mile off a forest road that she had found on an app and which had exactly 1 review, written 3 years prior, that said only, "Came out fine." Not going back. She had taken the review as a minor eccentricity and booked the road trip around it. On the 1st night, nothing unusual occurred. She ate her camp dinner, read by headlamp, fell asleep to the ordinary forest sounds and woke with the ordinary forest light. She spent the day hiking a ridge trail that offered views she photographed from every angle, ate lunch by a creek, and returned to camp feeling exactly as content as she had hoped. On the 2nd night, at some point around 2 a.m., she woke. Not from a sound, or not exactly. She woke with the alert, instant clarity that your body produces when something is already registered below conscious awareness. She lay in her sleeping bag and listened. Quiet at first. Then footsteps, not one set. Multiple. She couldn't count them, but multiple, moving in a slow circuit around her campsite. not the random movement of an animal investigating an unfamiliar smell. A circuit, deliberate, paced, organized. She reached slowly for her bear spray and her headlamp. The footsteps stopped. She lay perfectly still, hand on both objects, not turning on the light. Whatever was outside had heard her move. It had stopped in response to her movement. That was the thing that separated it from any animal she had encountered, the immediacy of the reaction. The intelligence of it. A deer that heard you move would crash away. A bear would huff, would give you time. Whatever was outside had heard her reach for her headlamp and had instantly become still, like it was listening back. She waited 20 minutes without moving. Nothing. She eventually turned on the headlamp, unzipped the tent, swept the light around the clearing. Empty. Nothing there, but in the soft ground at the edge of the clearing, visible even from the tent door and the beam of her headlamp, there were impressions. She went out in the morning and looked at them properly. Not paw prints, not hoof prints, not anything she could match to the regional wildlife guide on her phone. They were almost footprints, 2 points of contact for each impression. A wide, flat forward point and a narrower heel. But the proportions were wrong. Too long, too narrow, the stride too wide. And they were everywhere. Not a single circuit as she had imagined. Dozens of loops, overlapping, as though whatever had made them had been circling her tent, not for 20 minutes, but for hours. She broke camp immediately and hiked back to her car. She was almost at the forest road when she heard it again. Footsteps, behind her, matching her pace exactly. She stopped, they stopped. She walked fast, they walked fast. She turned around. The trail was empty. Sunlight and trees and birdsong. Normal, perfectly ordinary. She turned back toward the car, walked, listened. The footsteps had not resumed. But for the last 100 meters to the car, she had the distinct, absolute, physical certainty of something standing behind her. Not following, standing still, watching her walk away. She got in the car. She drove. She has never posted the photographs from that trip. When her friends ask about the Breck Forest weekend, she says the weather was bad. She never mentions the footprints. She never mentions the circuit. She never mentions the thing that stood at the edge of the clearing and watched her sleep. She did email the app that listed the campsite, asking them to remove it. They replied that they couldn't find any listing matching her description. When she went back to the app to send a screenshot, it was gone. The listing had never existed. Story 7. The last camper, the tent was still standing when the Rangers found it. That was the first unusual thing. 7 weeks since the last confirmed sighting of Daniel Ash, 32, solo camper, reported missing by his employer when he failed to return to work. 7 weeks of autumn rain and 1 early frost. And the tent, a lightweight backpacking model, the kind that was not designed for extended exposure, was still standing. The poles hadn't buckled. The fabric hadn't degraded. The stakes were still in the ground as though someone had driven them in that morning. Inside, sleeping bag, pad, cook set, 1 week's worth of food untouched in a bear canister. Phone, fully discharged. Journal, no Daniel Ash. Ranger Cook had done missing persons work for 11 years. She had found campers who had fallen into ravines, campers who had succumbed to hypothermia 50 feet from a marked trail, campers who had experienced medical emergencies and simply never woke up. She had also found, twice in her career, campers who had walked into the wilderness and made the choice not to come back. This felt like none of those. She read the journal in the ranger station that night, beginning to end. The first 3 days were standard camper entries: weather, trail conditions, wildlife sightings, what he'd cooked for dinner. Daniel Ash was a clear, methodical writer. He listed things. He used specific language. He was, from the evidence of those early entries, someone who paid close attention to his surroundings. Day 4 was the first entry that was different. Heard something last night that I can't explain. Not going to write it down yet because I'll sound like an idiot and I don't want this journal to sound like that. Just noting it happened. Day 5. It happened again. 3 nights in a row now. I'm not scared. I just want to understand what it is. I've been camping for 12 years. I know what's out here. This isn't any of it. Day 6 was a full page. Ranger Cook read it 3 times. I found something today. Off trail, maybe a quarter-mile northwest of camp, I was following a creek bed and I came out into a depression, like a natural bowl in the terrain, maybe 30 feet across. The trees around it are all dead. Not diseased, they died suddenly, from the look of it. All at the same time. They're still standing, but there's no bark left on them, and no branches either. Just trunks. White, almost like bone. In the center of the depression there's a ring. Stones, set in a circle maybe 10 feet across. Old, they're half sunk into the ground, which takes a very long time. Whoever placed them has been gone a very long time. I took photographs. When I got back to camp and looked at the photographs, they showed a depression in the forest. Dead trees. But no stones. In every photograph I took, the stone ring is simply not there. The ground where it should be is just ground. I'm going back tomorrow. The following day's entry was 4 words. It knows I'm here. After that, 3 blank pages. And then the final entry, in handwriting that was still precise, still controlled, but somehow different in a way that Ranger Cook couldn't quite articulate. As though the same person was writing with a hand that no longer entirely belonged to them. I understand now. The stones aren't a circle. They're a door. You don't open a door from this side. The problem is that something opened it from the other side a long time ago and nobody closed it. I'm going to go and look at it one more time. I need to see it in the dark. If someone reads this, and I don't think they will, not in time, don't look for the depression. Don't follow the creek northwest. Don't count the standing trees, because they aren't standing anymore. Not really. They're waiting. Ranger Cook went to the depression the next morning. She found it where the journal described, a quarter-mile northwest, following the creek. The bowl in the terrain. The dead white trees. She found the stone circle. She photographed it extensively. Every photograph came out showing the depression, the dead trees, and empty ground where the circle should have been. She stood at the edge and looked at it for a long time. She did not go in. She filed her report. The case remained open. Daniel Ash was entered into the missing persons registry. The tent was dismantled and removed. The gear was cataloged and stored. Ranger Cook kept one thing that wasn't in her report. A single item she found, not inside the tent, but outside it, placed on the ground beside the door, as though left there deliberately for whoever came looking. A stone, smooth, palm-sized, white as bone. She kept it on her desk for 6 weeks. She threw it away when she noticed one morning that it had moved 3 inches overnight. She hadn't touched it. Nobody else had been in the office. Story 8. Don't look behind the trees. It started as a rule between the children. Don't look behind the trees. Nobody could remember who had said it first. It had always been there, the way certain rules always exist between children before adults know about them, passed in whispers on the school bus, reinforced on the playground, absolute and unquestioned in the way that only children's rules can be. Don't step on the cracks. Don't open your eyes underwater. Don't look behind the trees. The trees in question were the ones at the edge of the Holloway estate. A long line of old growth beeches running along the property's north border, so old and so large that their canopies interlocked into a continuous ceiling 30 feet above the ground. Between their massive, silver-smooth trunks, the shadows were very dark, even in full daylight. Everybody in the village of Thane knew the rule. Every adult had known it as a child. Nobody, when pressed, could explain where it came from. Anthropologist Dr. Sable Marsh came to Thane for other reasons entirely. She was documenting post-industrial community rituals in rural England, a project funded by her university with enough budget for 6 months of fieldwork. The children's rule was a footnote in her notes at first, something interesting, something to mention in a chapter about place-based superstition. She started asking about it in her 3rd month. "Don't look behind the trees," said an 81-year-old retired farmer named George without hesitation when she mentioned the Holloway beeches. We all knew that. Where does it come from? He looked at her as though the question was odd. It comes from the trees. She tried to unpack that. The best she could reconstruct, from interviews with 23 residents across 4 generations, was this. The rule had no origin story. It had no moment of creation. Every person she spoke to had known it their entire life and assumed they had been told it by someone older, but when she traced those chains backward, they all dissolved at the same point. Nobody could identify the person who had told them. They simply knew, the way children know things that are true without being able to source the truth. She also discovered, buried in the Village Historical Society's records, a document from 1887. A letter from the then owner of the Holloway estate to a neighbor, complaining about the boundary beeches and stating his intention to have them cut down. He had not cut them down. The following letter in the archive, dated 3 weeks later, made no mention of the trees at all, as though he had forgotten he ever intended to remove them. But in the margin of the second letter, in a different hand, smaller, less confident, someone had written 4 words. I looked. Don't look. Dr. Marsh went to the trees on an October afternoon, alone, with her notebook and her recorder. She walked the line of beeches from south to north, studying them. They were remarkable trees, the kind of beech that appears in ecology textbooks. Canopies like cathedral architecture. Roots like the exposed musculature of something vast. She took notes on their dimensions, their spacing, the quality of the shadows between them. She followed the rule. She did not look behind them. At the northern end of the line, where the last tree stood at the corner of the estate boundary, she stopped. She stood with her back to the beeches and looked out at the open field. She was conducting an experiment in herself. Why don't I look? Not why shouldn't I? She was a scientist. She didn't believe in children's rules. But why don't I? What is the mechanism? What in me is following this instruction without being told to? She turned around slowly. She looked behind the trees. She wrote up her findings 9 months later, from a position she described to her university as remote working. The chapter on the Holloway beeches was the most read section of her eventual publication, cited by researchers in folklore, psychology, and, unusually, several in perceptual neuroscience. She described what she had seen with complete scientific precision: the shadows between the beeches, the quality of the light, the specific visual experience of the spaces between those ancient trunks. What she did not include in the publication, what she told only one colleague, over the phone, at some length, was the subjective experience, the part that she could not write in academic language. I looked, she said, and for a moment, a fraction of a second, genuinely, I couldn't process what I was seeing. Like my brain refused to assemble the image. Like the visual cortex hit something it wasn't equipped for and just stopped. "What did you see?" her colleague asked. "When it resolved?" "Nothing. Shadows and roots and old bark." "So the rule is superstition." "I thought so," she said. "But here's what I can't explain. I have been a scientist for 22 years. I have never in my life had a somatic response to a visual stimulus that I couldn't subsequently rationalize. And when I looked behind those trees, my body did something before my mind could catch up, before I could see anything, before any image had formed." She paused. I took a step back, involuntary, like a flinch, like something in my nervous system. Something older than cognition, older than language, had already processed what was there and told my body to get away from it. "What do you think that means?" She was quiet for a long moment. "I think," she said carefully, "that the rule doesn't exist because someone looked and was frightened. I think the rule exists because whatever is behind those trees has learned, over a very long period of time, to only be visible for a fraction of a second. Just long enough for something ancient in the human nervous system to recognize it and flinch. But not long enough to know what it is. Not long enough to describe it. Not long enough to prove it. Just long enough to know, in every cell, in every instinct you have, that you should not have looked." She paused again. "The rule isn't superstition," she said. "The rule is survival. Don't look behind the trees. You already know why,